What's gaming, gamers? Have you ever wanted a Stasis build that allowed you to deal 25% more damage for free, have a near 100% uptime on freezing targets, and heal you whenever you get a kill? Well, this Icefall Mantle Stasis Titan build fits that bill absolutely perfectly. Additionally, this build takes significant advantage of the Devour buff. If you're confused on how to get the Devour buff on the Stasis subclass, stick around for the weapons section of this video. But before I get into the build itself, I'd like to shout out our clan, the Tyrant Seraphs. If you're looking for people to play any content in Destiny with, ranging from ritual playlist and seasonal activities all the way to raids and Grandmaster strikes, feel free to join the Discord server. We welcome anyone, no matter how new or seasoned you are, and all of us will teach encounters if you don't know something. If you're interested, hop into the Discord server and play some Destiny with us. The link is in the description. Additionally, if you'd like to watch me play games more often, come hang out with me over on Twitch. I plan to stream more consistently starting shortly, so if that's something that interests you, the link for my Twitch channel is in the description. With promotion out of the way, I can get into the Icefall Mantle Exotic Arms armor and what it does in case you're not aware. Icefall Mantle has the exotic perk Glacial Guard, which grants your Stasis Final Blows the chance to apply the Stasis Weapon Surge buff for 11 seconds. Additional Stasis Final Blows have the chance to further this Weapon Surge buff's potency all the way up to a ×4 Stasis Weapon Surge. At 4 stacks of the Weapon Surge buff, every Stasis kill will increase the Weapon Surge buff's timer up to its maximum of 11 seconds. Next, Icefall Mantle removes your class ability in favor of a personal overshield. Upon the activation of your class ability, you're granted all 4 stacks of the Stasis Weapon Surge buff for 11 seconds, a 100 health overshield with a 62.5% damage resistance to all incoming damage for 20 seconds, and you apply 40 slow stacks to all enemies nearby you. While this overshield is active, taking damage refreshes its 20-second timer back to its maximum of 20 seconds, but you're prevented from sprinting, double jumping, and sliding. Activating your class ability again while the overshield is active will remove the overshield, but will then allow you to sprint, double jump, and slide, as well as allowing your class ability to regenerate. Now that you know what Icefall Mantle does, I can get into the build itself, starting with the subclass setup. I'll first put everything on screen as a prescriptive setup if that's what you prefer, and once I've done that, I'll detail what each subclass element does, why I've chosen it, as well as any alternative options should there be any. For the prescriptive subclass setup, run the Glacial Quake Super, the Towering Barricade, whichever jump you prefer, the Shiver Strike Melee, the Glacier Grenade, the Howl of the Storm aspect, the Tectonic Harvest aspect, Whisper of Chains, Whisper of Fissures, Whisper of Rime, and Whisper of Shards. To describe the subclass in more detail, firstly the Super. Glacial Quake is the only option to choose, so of course it must be brought. However, Glacial Quake can be a great damage super if you use it right. Upon casting Glacial Quake, any enemy within 8 meters of you is instantly frozen. Furthermore, any stasis crystals or frozen targets you touch will instantly shatter while the super is active. Glacial Quake's light attack is a supercharged Shiver Strike, which will send you forwards into enemies, damaging them and significantly knocking them back. However, where Glacial Quake's damage comes from is its heavy attack. Upon using your heavy, you slam the ground where you stand, creating 3 waves of stasis crystals that propagate forwards in a cone shape in front of you. These crystals are where the damage from the super comes from. The larger the boss or group of enemies you're fighting is, the more crystals will shatter and the more damage the super will do. This super is especially potent when combined with this season's artifact, but I'll get into that in more detail when I go over the artifact itself later in the video. As for the Barricade, it genuinely doesn't matter which you run, as the Icefall Mantle Exotic Arms set your class ability's cooldown to the Towering Barricades anyways. Additionally, you can't actually place a barricade with this build, as using your class ability grants you the overshield, further removing the purpose of choosing any specific barricade ability. The melee ability, Shiver Strike, is the only option to choose, but it's a decent melee ability. Holding your melee input will send you forward, and upon letting go of your melee input, you'll dash into an enemy, dealing damage to them, knocking them back, and applying 50 slow stacks to them. The melee ability will mostly be used by the Howl of the Storm aspect, but I'll talk more about that aspect shortly. Onto the grenade, the Glacier Grenade is brought as this build revolves heavily around the use of stasis crystals, and the Glacier Grenade provides those in spades. Much of this build is designed to generate, regenerate, and refund grenade energy, so the Glacier Grenade's long base cooldown isn't a concern for this build specifically. When thrown, the Glacier Grenade will summon 5 stasis crystals in a line perpendicular to the angle from which it was thrown. These crystals will provide grenade regeneration, damage resistance, and damage onto enemies who are nearby the crystals when they're shattered. Onto the aspects, firstly, Howl of the Storm will allow you to use your powered melee ability while sliding to summon 4 stasis crystals in a straight line in front of you. Howl of the Storm summons 1 small crystal, 2 medium crystals, and 1 large crystal, but the size of the crystal doesn't matter when it comes to the grenade regeneration rate after destroying a crystal, or the damage resistance applied when nearby crystals, so their size doesn't matter. It's also a great tool for instantly freezing mages if you don't have a Glacier Grenade on cooldown, as I generally only use the Shiver Strike for the purposes of this aspect. The second aspect, Tectonic Harvest, causes a small stasis shard to be summoned upon the destruction of any stasis crystal. This is another reason why the generation and subsequent destruction of stasis crystals is important, as stasis shards are also a fantastic help for this build. Upon the collection of a stasis shard, you'll be granted melee energy and health or an overshield depending on whether your health is full or not at the time of collection. The melee energy granted is helpful for your Howl of the Storm uptime, and the healing and overshield granting capabilities are small bonuses to your survivability. Onto the fragments, firstly there's Whisper of Chains. Whisper of Chains will grant you a 40% damage resistance when within close proximity of either a frozen enemy or a stasis crystal. This damage resistance lingers for about half a second upon not being close to a frozen enemy or crystal, but is a great tool for survivability when you are nearby frozen enemies or stasis crystals. With this build's stasis crystal generation capabilities specifically, you'll have this damage resistance quite often. Whisper of Chains also increases your recovery stat by 10 points, which is a small but nice boost to your overall health regeneration. Next for fragments, Whisper of Fissures will add a second damage burst when shattering either a frozen target or a stasis crystal. This damage burst deals a relatively small amount of damage to enemies caught within it, but that's not the main reason this fragment is brought. Whisper of Fissures also increases the damage dealt to the enemy who has been frozen when they're shattered, which is incredibly helpful against bosses especially. This increases the damage of your Glacier Grenade, any chill clip weapon you may have equipped, and your super. All of those make Whisper of Fissures a fantastic fragment to bring. The third fragment, Whisper of Rime, will cause the collection of stasis shards to grant you a small amount of stasis overshield for 10 seconds. Collecting additional shards will increase the amount of health the overshield has up to 50 HP, as well as refreshing the overshield's timer back to 10 seconds. If you're not full health when you collect a stasis shard, you'll be granted 5 health for small shards and 35 health for large shards. This is a small little bit of healing, but the Stasis Overshield is the main reason this fragment is brought, and with this build's Stasis Shard creation capabilities, you'll be generating and collecting shards often enough that you'll have the Overshield a large portion of the time. Lastly for fragments is Whisper of Shards. Whisper of Shards is incredibly helpful for your grenade's regeneration. Upon the shattering of any Stasis Crystal, your grenade is granted a 500% increase to its recharge rate for 6 seconds. This buff can be increased to a maximum of 11 seconds by shattering additional stasis crystals, and can be extended to this 11-second maximum indefinitely so long as you continue to shatter stasis crystals. This fragment causes a positive feedback loop between your Glacier Grenade and itself, as the throwing of your Glacier Grenade generates stasis crystals, which can then be destroyed, granting you a 500% increase to your Glacier Grenade's recharge rate. Additionally, both the Howl of the Storm aspect and your Glacial Quake super will be generating stasis crystals often, which will both help immensely with your Glacier Grenade's uptime. There are a couple of alternative fragments you can use as well. The first one, Whisper of Refraction, will grant you class ability energy upon the defeat of any target affected by a stasis debuff, with the tier of enemy killed granting you a differing amount of class ability energy. Unfortunately, however, this fragment has no effect while your class ability overshield is active, as Icefall Mantle prevents any form of class ability energy from being acquired while the Glacial Guard itself is active. As this is the case, I choose not to bring this fragment and instead rely on Armour mods to refund my class ability energy, but Whisper of Refraction can be a very useful tool in higher difficulty activities, so use it and see if it suits your playstyle more. Next, for alternative fragments, Whisper of Rending will cause your primary ammo weapons to deal 100% increased damage to stasis crystals and 50% increased damage to frozen targets. This works for all primary ammo weapons, including Fighting Lion, as well as Revision 0 and Vex Mythoclast's alternate fire modes if those are weapons you enjoy using. This is a very helpful fragment, especially for dealing with majors and champions you've frozen, as the 50% increased damage to frozen targets with primary ammo weapons is multiplicative with Icefall Mantle's 25% flat damage boost to stasis weapons. If you are to use either of those alternative fragments, I'd recommend swapping out Whisper of Fissures. The increased damage from defeating frozen targets is most helpful for your super's damage against bosses, and as that doesn't happen all too often, it's the most replaceable of the 4 prescriptive fragments. With the subclass now detailed, I can get into the artifact setup I recommend using with this build if you're watching this video during Season 23, the Season of the Wish. This season's artifact isn't particularly favorable for the Stasis subclass, but there are a few mods that are incredibly helpful for this build's effectiveness, especially when pushing higher difficulty content. Firstly, in the 4th column, the Pillar of Ice mod will cause the defeat of any frozen target to summon a stasis crystal nearby to the location the enemy died. Normal enemies summon 1 crystal, and bosses summon 2 crystals so long as they die while frozen. This mod has no cooldown and doesn't require critical hits like the Headstone weapon mod does, which is helpful if you don't have a headstone weapon or if you know your aim to be poor. This build will be freezing and then defeating those frozen targets constantly, which means you'll be summoning this stasis crystal just as frequently. The biggest perk of these stasis crystals is their interaction with the Whisper of Shards fragment, which grants you a 500% increase to your grenade's recharge rate. This makes Pillar of Ice an amazing utility mod for not only increasing your overall stasis crystal and AoE damage uptime, but also increasing your grenade's uptime significantly. The only other must-pick artifact mod is the Hail the Storm mod in the 5th column. Hail the Storm increases the damage of shattering both frozen targets and stasis crystals, with the damage increase to shattering frozen enemies being 12.5% and the damage increase to shattering stasis crystals being 28.6%. Furthermore, Hail the Storm causes the shattering of stasis crystals to summon 5 ice shards in a star-like pattern around the destroyed stasis crystal that propagate outwards, seeking nearby enemies. Once these ice shards hit an enemy, they deal damage to them and apply an amount of slow stacks to that enemy. Hail the Storm is incredibly helpful for spreading both the slow and freeze debuffs, as well as passively increasing the amount of damage and utility your stasis crystals provide to this build. Now that I've gone over the few artifact mods that are beneficial to this build, I can get into the armors setup that I recommend for this build, starting with the stat distribution. Stat distribution for this build is fairly straightforward. In the top 3 stat grouping of Mobility, Resilience, and Recovery, spec into Resilience and Recovery equally, and ignore Mobility altogether. Mobility simply increases your walking, strafing, and crouching movement speeds, as well as your initial jump height, which are all things this build has no use for. As such, Mobility can be entirely ignored. However, I do recommend having at least 30 points in the stat, as that will ensure your jumps don't land short of particularly long distance or high height jumps. Resilience dictates your total amount of health and shields, as well as your overall damage resistance, which makes it a great stat for use with this build. This build is designed to make heavy use of damage resistance, so having your base resistance from Resilience as high as possible is very helpful for your overall survivability. Recovery dictates the delay between taking damage and the start of your health regeneration, as well as increasing the rate at which you regenerate your health. This is a very helpful stat to have when running this build, as this build doesn't have any intrinsic healing tools outside of the small amount of health granted by Whisper of Rime. Armor mods and weapon choice help with healing, but the higher your recovery stat is, the easier and quicker it will be to heal when you need to. As for the bottom 3 stat grouping of Discipline, Intellect, and Strength, spec into Discipline first, with Strength second, and ignore Intellect altogether. Discipline is by far the most important stat to spec into in the bottom 3 grouping, as it dictates the base recharge rate of your grenade ability. The faster your grenade recharges, the more you can throw, increasing your stasis crystal uptime, and by extension, your overall grenade recharge rate, your damage output, stasis shard creation capabilities, and your damage resistance. All of those reasons make Discipline incredibly important to spec into, much more so than the other 2 stats in the bottom 3 grouping. Speaking of those stats, Intellect is entirely useless for this build, as all Intellect does is lower the base cooldown of your super. It does nothing besides that, so don't even bother putting any points into Intellect. Keep it at tier 3 if you can, as that will ensure your super's cooldown isn't any longer than its base, but try not to go any higher than tier 3 either. Next, Strength is slightly important for this build, as it decreases the base cooldown of your melee ability, but this build has a high uptime on stasis shards, which grant a large amount of melee energy as is. Furthermore, you won't be using the melee ability as much as you'll be using your grenade, so don't forego any points in Discipline in favor of Strength, as Discipline is significantly more important. My armor stats have me at 31 Mobility, 90 Resilience, 90 Recovery, 103 Discipline, 22 Intellect, and 51 Strength. With stat distribution detailed, I can get into the armor's mod setup I recommend for this build. I'll first put everything on screen as a prescriptive setup if that's what you prefer, and once I've done that, I'll get into detail regarding the armor's mods, what each mod does, why I've chosen each mod, as well as any alternative mod options should there be any. For the prescriptive setup, on your helmet, run 2 harmonic siphon mods and 1 heavy ammo finder mod. On your arms, run 2 grenade kickstart mods. On your chest piece, simply run whichever resistance mods you need for the content you'll be running. On your legs, run 1 innervation mod, 1 recuperation mod, and 1 stacks on stacks mod. Lastly, on your mark, run 1 bomber mod and 2 reaper mods. To describe the armor's mod setup, I'll start with the helmet's mods. The 2 harmonic siphon mods will cause a potent orb of power to be summoned upon getting a multi-kill with your stasis weapons. Orbs of power will be very helpful for this build, as they are for every build. Orbs of power will grant you armor charge for your grenade kickstart mods, grenade energy due to the innervation mod on your legs, health via the recuperation mod on your legs, as well as an amount of super energy correspondent to the potency of the orb. All of those reasons make the generation of orbs of power important, and the potency of the orb simply grants you more super energy per orb picked up, which is why 2 harmonic siphons are brought instead of just 1. The heavy ammo finder mod will cause your weapon final blows to progress a hidden counter that, once reaching 100%, will summon a brick of heavy ammo. Finder bricks grant you less ammo than a normal heavy brick by default, but the trade-off is the consistency with which you can generate heavy bricks with the finder mod. The specifics regarding the hidden counter are quite complex, and it would take me too long to go over it in full detail. However, I can tell you that primary ammo weapons progress the counter's percentage the fastest, and exotic weapons progress the counter even faster by applying a multiplier to the base percentage. Lastly, regarding ammo finders, the rocket-assisted sidearm weapon frame inherits the significantly increased ammo finder generation inherent to primary ammo weapons, even though they're special weapons. This includes the Buried Bloodline Exotic Sidearm. Onto the arms mods, the 2 grenade kickstart mods together will refund you a significant amount of grenade energy upon the use of your grenade. The figures I'm about to share with you are specific to both the Glacier Grenade and the Cold Snap Grenade, and will not apply to the Duskfield Grenade should you decide to use that grenade. With 2 grenade kickstart mods applied, you'll be refunded a minimum of 17.75% grenade energy upon the use of your grenade. This is applicable if you only have 1 stack of armor charge. However, as this build uses the stacks on stacks mod on your legs, you'll never have just 1 stack of armor charge. Instead, this build's minimum refunded grenade energy is 21.5% with 2 stacks of armor charge. With 3 stacks of armor charge, which is this build's maximum amount, you'll be refunded 24% of your grenade's energy upon the use of your grenade. Grenade Kickstart will be incredibly helpful for your grenade's uptime, and if your armor stats allow you to run 3 Kickstart mods, I highly recommend doing so. That will even further increase your grenade's uptime. For your chest pieces mods, simply running whichever resistance mods you need for the content you'll be running will suffice. My usual resistance mod setup includes 2 resistance mods that correspond to the element of the activity's threat modifier, and then 1 separate element's resistance mod. However, if you don't feel you need all 3 resistance mods, a charged up mod would be a helpful tool for your grenade's uptime, as it'll allow you to hold 1 extra stack of armor charge. Having 4 stacks of armor charge increases your maximum refunded grenade energy via the Grenade Kickstart mod from 24% to 25.81%, which isn't much of a significant increase, but it is more refunded energy overall. It's both because of the very slight increase to refunded energy and the fact that it's only applicable when you have all 4 stacks of armor charge that I choose not to run the charged up mod, but it's a decent option in lower difficulty activities wherein you don't need all 3 resistance mods. Onto your legs mods, firstly, the Innervation mod will grant you 6.25% grenade energy upon the collection of any orb of power with no cooldown. This increases your grenade's uptime noticeably, so even though it seems like a small amount of grenade energy, it's worthwhile to bring. Next, the Recuperation mod will grant you 70 health instantly upon the collection of any orb of power with no cooldown. This mod is incredibly helpful for survivability, and is a mainstay in every single build of mine regardless of activity difficulty, class or subclass choice, or anything else. Recuperation is a fantastic utility mod for survivability, and as it only costs 1 energy to slot, there's never reason enough not to run it. Recuperation not only makes the collection of orbs of power safer, it also makes orbs of power themselves act as effective healing wells, which allows you to be a little bit more aggressive in your playstyle and still be survivable. Lastly, for legs mods, the Stacks on Stacks mod will cause the collection of any orb of power to grant you 2 stacks of armor charge instead of just 1. This increases your overall grenade uptime a significant amount, as it almost guarantees you'll always have at least 2 stacks of armor charge when you throw your grenade, so long as you've collected at least 1 orb of power. If you don't want to run the stacks on stacks, you can swap it out for an elemental charge mod, which by itself will grant you 1 stack of armor charge for every 4th stasis shard you collect. Elemental charge can be very helpful for your armor charge as well, but I find it to be more effective when running decaying armor charge mods, and as this build doesn't take advantage of those, I personally prefer stacks on stacks. Lastly, for your marks mods, the bomber mod will grant you 7.5% grenade ability energy upon the use of your class ability. You should never use this mod actively to regenerate your grenade ability. Bomber is brought entirely as a passive bonus to your grenade's uptime when your grenade happens to be on cooldown when you need to use your Glacial Guard class ability. The 2 Reaper mods are similar to Bomber in that way. Reaper will cause your next weapon final blow after having used your class ability to summon a potent orb of power, but it should never be used actively and is simply a passive bonus to the utility of your Glacial Guard class ability. With the Armor's mod setup now detailed, I'll get into my recommendations for weapons to use with this build. I'll start with the kinetic slot, then move into the heavy slot, saving the energy slot for last, as that's the slot the Buried Bloodline Exotic Sidearm will be occupying. For your kinetic slot, running a Stasis primary ammo weapon in this slot is highly recommended. It will synergize with your Harmonic Siphon mods in your helmet, has weapon perks that synergize with the Stasis subclass, and most of all, will be granted a 25% damage boost from the Icefall Mantle Exotic Arms armor. As for specific Stasis primary ammo weapons to run, there are the Judgment Stasis Hand Cannon from the Prophecy Dungeon with the perk combination of Demolitionist and Adrenaline Junkie, the Prolonged Engagement Stasis Submachine Gun from the Vanguard weapon pool with the perk combination of Outlaw and Headstone, the Rapacious Appetite Stasis Submachine Gun from the Season of the Deep with the perk combination of Perpetual Motion and Headstone, and the Unending Tempest Stasis Submachine Gun from the Crucible weapon pool with the perk combination of Demolitionist and Headstone. For the power slot, I recommend running either a Stasis Machine Gun or Grenade Launcher, as they'll benefit the most from the 25% damage boost granted by Icefall Mantle. However, Stasis rocket launchers are also great options for dealing damage to bosses and champions, especially those who float off the ground, making themselves effectively immune to your super. As for specific power weapons I recommend using, there are the Chain of Command Stasis Machine Gun from the Season of the Haunted, now purchasable from the Monument to Lost Light in the Tower with the perk combination of Demolitionist and Adrenaline Junkie, the Cold Comfort Stasis Rocket Launcher from the Ghosts of the Deep Dungeon with the perk combination of Envious Assassin and Bait and Switch, the Dimensional Hypotrochoid Stasis Heavy Wave Frame Grenade Launcher from the Lightfall weapon pool with the perk combination of Envious Assassin and Chain Reaction, and the Slammer Stasis Sword from the Nightfall weapon pool with the perk combination of Chain Reaction and Cold Steel. Now I'll detail the Buried Bloodline Exotic Sidearm, as it's the centerpiece of the weapon loadout itself. Buried Bloodline has the exotic perk Hungering Quarrel, which grants you 11 health every time you hit an enemy with the weapon. However, where Buried Bloodline shines with this build is with its exotic trait, Violent Reanimation. Violent Reanimation will grant you the Devour buff for 10 seconds after having gotten multiple kills with Buried Bloodline. Kills against rank and file enemies grant you 25% progress towards activating Devour, and any enemy elite and above will instantly grant you Devour upon being killed with Buried Bloodline. If you have Buried Bloodline's Catalyst, the weapon itself will apply the Weaken effect to any enemy damaged by it for 5 seconds, so long as the Devour buff is active when the enemy is damaged. Devour is incredibly helpful for this build, and is the sole reason Buried Bloodline is used with this build. As soon as the Devour buff is activated, you are healed for 100 health, and any kill while Devour is active will heal you for a further 100 health, on top of increasing the duration of the buff itself by 5 seconds. Furthermore, any kill acquired while Devour is active will grant you a differing amount of grenade energy depending on the tier of enemy killed. As this build revolves heavily around the grenade ability's uptime and has no intrinsic healing capabilities, Buried Bloodline filling both of those roles all by its lonesome makes it a fantastic weapon for use with this build. If you don't have Buried Bloodline, this build will not be nearly as good for pushing higher difficulty content, but will still be fantastic for use in Vanguard strikes and activities with similar difficulty. With the rest of the build now detailed, I can get into some playstyle tips and tricks I have for use with this build. Firstly, upon entering an engagement, before doing anything, activate Devour by getting kills with your Buried Bloodline. Once you've done that, start to get stasis kills by using your abilities and weapons to build up stacks of the stasis weapon surge. I don't recommend throwing your grenade until you've got armor charge stacks. If you want to get stasis ability kills right away, use your Howl of the Storm aspect and summon crystals using that. Howl of the Storm will do effectively the same thing as your Glacier Grenade, but won't consume the grenade, ensuring you can generate and collect an orb of power or two before you use your grenade, which will refund you grenade energy via the grenade kickstart mods. Other than that, this build's fairly simple. If your Devour runs out, proc it again using Buried Bloodline. Generate and collect Orbs of Power, create and destroy Stasis Crystals, and get kills while Devour is active to regenerate your grenade ability as quickly as possible. Use your heavy weapon on mages and bosses, use your super on bosses, and have fun. And that's all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see more content like this, liking the video, leaving a comment, or even subscribing all help me out a ton. Sharing it with a friend whom you think might enjoy it is also helpful, so if you know any Titans who enjoy Stasis, send them this guide. Other than that, if you'd like to join our clan, the Tyrant Seraphs, the link to the Discord server is in the description below. Additionally, if you'd like to watch me stream some games sometime, come hang out with me over on Twitch. The link for that is also in the description. Lastly, if you have any questions or constructive criticisms, leave them in the comments. I read all of them and reply to all that I can. Thank you again for watching, and have a great day!